In the brutal arena of Renaissance politics, Niccolò Machiavelli faced a catastrophic personal downfall, imprisoned, tortured, and exiled by the very power structure he once served. Rather than surrendering to bitterness, he developed a revolutionary mental discipline that transformed human understanding of power. This documentary reveals the systematic training method Machiavelli forged during his darkest hours, a psychological framework that allowed him to analyze his tormentors with cold, strategic clarity rather than emotional reactivity. What emerged wasn't just political philosophy, but a sophisticated emotional control system still used by today's most effective leaders and strategists. If you've ever found yourself making crucial decisions while emotionally compromised, subscribe now to master the mental discipline that separates true strategic thinkers from those perpetually hijacked by emotional chaos. Chapter 1. The Emotional Battlefield. The average American makes 35,000 decisions daily, from minor choices to life-altering judgments. What few realize is that approximately 90% of these decisions occur in a neurologically compromised state. This isn't speculative philosophy but hard neuroscience. When emotions activate, blood literally drains from our prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for strategic thinking, creating what neuroscientists call cognitive impairment under emotional load. The consequences are profound. A 2023 study from Harvard Medical School found that financial decisions made under even mild emotional arousal resulted in an average 23% reduction in optimal outcomes. More disturbing was their finding that participants remained completely unaware of this impairment, maintaining the illusion of rational choice while demonstrating measurable cognitive decline. This neurological vulnerability creates what psychologists call the strategic gap, the critical space between emotional trigger and response, where true power is either maintained or surrendered. In that gap lies the difference between reactive decision-making and strategic calculation. As Dr. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford explains, the human who can maintain prefrontal function while emotionally activated holds an almost unfair advantage over others. It's the cognitive equivalent of bringing a gun to a knife fight. Corporate America has quantified this advantage. McKinsey & Company's analysis of executive performance found that leaders who maintained decision quality under emotional pressure outperformed peers by 43% on key metrics. This wasn't correlated with intelligence or experience, but rather with specific mental discipline techniques that preserved cognitive function during emotional activation. Renaissance Florence provided the perfect laboratory for observing these dynamics. Political power shifted rapidly, with emotional vendettas destroying families who had ruled for generations. Those who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or wealthiest, but rather those who maintained strategic clarity, while others became emotionally reactive. This pattern created what historians call the Florentine paradox, rational calculation consistently defeating emotional intensity, despite the latter's apparent strength. Machiavelli observed this dynamic firsthand. As Florence's second chancellor and diplomatic advisor from 1498 to 1512, he witnessed how emotional decisions by powerful leaders consistently led to their downfall. More significantly, he experienced this vulnerability personally when the returning Medici family imprisoned and tortured him based on emotional vengeance rather than strategic calculation, a decision that ultimately cost them his potential loyalty and instead created their most astute critic. The neurological basis for emotional vulnerability has only recently been scientifically validated. Dr. Antonio Damasio's research on decision-making demonstrates that emotions operate through what neuroscientists call somatic markers, bodily sensations that influence choices below conscious awareness. These markers create what Damasio calls non-conscious biasing of decision-making that occurs faster than rational thought can intercept. The business world offers stark examples of this vulnerability. A Harvard Business Review analysis of failed corporate mergers found that 78% involved decisions made during periods of what researchers called competitive emotional arousal, acquisitions driven by fear, jealousy, or pride rather than strategic calculation. The average value destruction from these emotionally driven decisions exceeded $2.6 billion per transaction. What makes Machiavelli's insight revolutionary was his recognition that this vulnerability could be systematically addressed through specific mental training. Unlike contemporary advice focused on emotional intelligence, which often merely increases awareness of emotions without actually improving strategic function during emotional states. Machiavelli developed what psychologists now call strategic detachment methodology. Chapter 2. Machiavelli's Mental Laboratory. On November 7, 1512, Niccolò Machiavelli's world collapsed. After 14 years of loyal service as Florence's diplomatic advisor, he was removed from office when the Medici family reclaimed power. Weeks later, falsely implicated in a conspiracy, he was imprisoned and tortured in the Bargello prison, experiencing 6 drops of the strappado, a technique that violently dislocated his shoulders. This catastrophic personal downfall created what historians call Machiavelli's crucible, the extreme circumstances that forced him to develop unprecedented mental discipline. Historical records reveal Machiavelli's remarkable response to this devastation. Rather than surrendering to bitterness or despair, natural responses to such betrayal, he systematically developed what psychologists now recognize as strategic emotional processing. Letters written during his subsequent exile show his methodical analysis of his torturer's motivations, the political circumstances that necessitated his suffering, and the strategic errors that created his vulnerability, all without the emotional reactivity that would have been not just understandable but expected. Historian Miles Unger notes the extraordinary nature of this response. Machiavelli didn't just endure his downfall, he transformed it into a laboratory for studying power dynamics. While experiencing perhaps the most emotionally devastating period of his life, he maintained analytical clarity that would have been remarkable even in detached circumstances. This wasn't stoic suppression, but rather a revolutionary approach to processing emotion while maintaining strategic function. The historical context provided Machiavelli unique perspective. Renaissance Florence operated on emotional vendetta culture, where families maintained multi-generational feuds through emotional rather than strategic decision-making. This environment created what political scientists call effective governance, rule driven by emotional responses rather than calculated interests. Machiavelli observed firsthand how this pattern consistently produced catastrophic outcomes for otherwise powerful figures. Modern neuroscience explains why Machiavelli's mental discipline was so revolutionary. Dr. Richard Davidson's research at Wisconsin-Madison demonstrates that untrained individuals experience what neuroscientists call emotional perseveration, the continued influence of emotional states on cognitive function long after the triggering event. Brain scans show amygdala activation and prefrontal suppression, persisting for hours or even days after strong emotional experiences, creating extended periods of strategic impairment. What distinguished Machiavelli's approach was his development of what psychologists now call emotional compartmentalization, the ability to experience emotions fully while preventing them from contaminating strategic analysis. This wasn't emotional suppression, but rather a sophisticated mental discipline that created neurological separation between affective experience and cognitive function. The method emerged from necessity. Exiled to his small property at Sant'Andrea in Percusina, Machiavelli described his daily routine in letters that reveal his systematic approach to mental discipline. Each evening, he would change from work clothes into royal and courtly garments before entering his study, to commune with the ancient courts of ancient men through their books. This ritual created what psychologists call cognitive state shifting, a deliberate transition between emotional and analytical processing. What makes this approach particularly valuable is its distinction from stoicism or emotional suppression. Unlike philosophical traditions that advocate detachment from emotions, Machiavelli's method involved fully experiencing emotions while preventing them from contaminating strategic thought. This creates what psychologists call dual processing capability, maintaining separate emotional and analytical tracks simultaneously, rather than attempting to eliminate emotion entirely. Chapter 3. The Exile Training Method. From his small farmhouse outside Florence, Machiavelli systematically developed what modern psychologists call strategic emotional processing, specific techniques for maintaining cognitive function during intense emotional states. What makes these methods particularly valuable is their development through necessity rather than theory, refined through practical application in perhaps the most emotionally challenging circumstances imaginable. The method begins with what Machiavelli called dispassionate analysis, the systematic examination of emotional situations through multiple interpretive frameworks. In letters written during exile, he described analyzing his downfall through political, historical, and personal lenses simultaneously, creating what psychologists now call cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift perspective rather than remaining fixed in emotional interpretation. Neuroimaging research validates this approach. Dr. Kevin Oxner's studies at Columbia University demonstrate that conscious reinterpretation of emotional stimuli increases activity in prefrontal regions while decreasing amygdala activation. This creates what neuroscientists call top-down regulation, the ability to modulate emotional processing through cognitive intervention, preserving strategic function during emotional activation. The second component involves what Machiavelli termed historical contextualization, comparing contemporary events to historical parallels. In The Prince, he analyzes modern situations alongside classical examples, creating what psychologists call temporal distancing, psychological separation achieved by viewing present circumstances through historical perspective. This technique creates what neuroscientists call conceptual expansion, broadening neural networks activated during analysis, which counteracts the narrowing effect of emotional arousal. Stanford research confirms this effect. Dr. James Gross's studies on emotional regulation demonstrate that historical comparison decreases what neuroscientists call emotional potentiation, the amplification of reactions during emotional states. By activating broader contextual networks, historical thinking counteracts the neural pattern of emotional fixation, creating psychological space for strategic analysis alongside emotional experience. The third element involves what Renaissance scholars call disciplined writing practice, Machiavelli's systematic habit of analyzing political situations through formal composition. During exile, he established a rigorous schedule, writing each evening regardless of emotional state. This practice created what psychologists call cognitive scaffolding, structured thought patterns that maintain function during emotional disruption. What distinguishes Machiavelli's approach is its focus on strategic function rather than emotional comfort. Unlike contemporary therapy aimed at reducing emotional distress, his method prioritized cognitive performance during emotional states. This creates what psychologists call strategic resilience, maintaining decision quality regardless of emotional conditions rather than attempting to eliminate those conditions. The method's fourth component involves what Machiavelli called multiple analysis, examining situations from adversaries' perspectives to identify strategic options invisible from a single viewpoint. This creates what cognitive scientists call perspective flexibility, the ability to shift analytical frameworks, which counteracts the perspective narrowing that typically occurs during emotional arousal. Chapter 4. Modern Applications of Machiavellian Discipline. Today's highest-performing professionals have rediscovered Machiavelli's mental discipline techniques, implementing them across diverse fields from corporate leadership to military operations. While rarely acknowledging their Renaissance origins, these modern applications demonstrate the enduring value of strategic emotional processing in high-stakes environments. The corporate world offers clear examples. Goldman Sachs implements what they call cognitive separation training for senior traders, specific techniques for maintaining analytical function during market volatility. Their internal performance data shows traders trained in these methods generate 31% higher returns during crisis periods than untrained counterparts. The training focuses not on emotional suppression, but rather on maintaining dual processing, experiencing market emotions fully, while preventing them from contaminating analytical judgment. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a noted Machiavelli scholar, applied these principles throughout his diplomatic career. What colleagues called his analytical detachment during international crises, maintaining strategic clarity while others became emotionally reactive, directly reflected Machiavellian discipline. As Kissinger himself noted, history is the best antidote to the delusion of the moment, a direct application of Machiavelli's historical contextualization technique. Military implementation appears in what the Naval War College calls strategic emotional resilience, training commanders to maintain decision quality under extreme pressure. Studies show officers trained in these methods make 42% fewer catastrophic errors during simulated combat scenarios compared to control groups. The training emphasizes what military psychologists call emotional processing without impairment, experiencing combat emotions fully while maintaining strategic function. The neuroscience underlying these modern applications has been extensively validated. Dr. James Gross at Stanford has demonstrated that specific cognitive techniques, perspective shifting, historical comparison, and analytical writing create measurable changes in brain activation patterns during emotional states. These practices increase activity in prefrontal regions associated with executive function, while decreasing amygdala hyperactivation, creating what neuroscientists call regulated emotional processing. The business value of these techniques has been quantified. McKinsey's analysis of acquisition outcomes found that companies implementing strategic emotional discipline programs for executive teams experienced 27% less value destruction during corporate mergers than industry averages. This represents billions in shareholder value preserved through systematic emotional regulation techniques during high-stakes decisions. What distinguishes modern Machiavellian applications from generic emotional intelligence is their focus on performance rather than awareness. While conventional approaches emphasize recognizing emotions, the Machiavellian method prioritizes maintaining cognitive function during emotional states, a more sophisticated and practically valuable skill. As Harvard Business School professor Dr. Amy Edmondson explains, awareness without regulation creates the worst of both worlds: full emotional impact without functional protection. Technology sector implementation appears in what Silicon Valley executives call strategic equanimity, maintaining decision clarity during volatile business conditions. Former Intel CEO Andy Grove's famous principle that only the paranoid survive reflects Machiavellian vigilance, while his lesser-known practice of analyzing threats through multiple interpretive frameworks directly applies Machiavelli's dispassionate analysis technique. The gender dimensions reveal important adaptations. Leadership researcher Dr. Herminia Ibarra found that women executives who succeed in male-dominated industries modify Machiavellian techniques to navigate what she calls the authenticity paradox, balancing strategic detachment with perceived emotional accessibility. This creates what Ibarra terms selective vulnerability, strategically choosing when to display emotion rather than attempting constant regulation. Chapter 5. Implementing strategic detachment. Developing Machiavellian mental discipline requires systematic practice rather than mere understanding. Unlike vague advice to control emotions, effective implementation involves specific techniques that create measurable improvements in cognitive function during emotional arousal. The process begins with what psychologists call emotional awareness without identification, recognizing emotional states without becoming absorbed by them. Neuroscience research shows this metacognitive stance activates what scientists call the observing self, brain networks that maintain perspective during emotional experiences. Harvard psychologist Dr. Susan David recommends a specific practice: labeling emotions precisely. I notice anxiety arising rather than identifying with them. I am anxious. This linguistic shift creates what neuroscientists call psychological distance, separation between self and emotional state that preserves cognitive function. The second implementation step involves what cognitive scientists call perspective broadening, systematically analyzing situations through multiple interpretive frameworks. Corporate implementation includes what McKinsey calls the strategic matrix, examining decisions through financial, competitive, organizational, and customer perspectives simultaneously. This technique activates what neuroscientists call distributed neural networks, preventing the perspective narrowing that typically occurs during emotional states. Practical application includes what executive coach Caroline Webb calls the multiple narrative exercise, writing 3 different interpretations of challenging situations to break emotional fixation. Research shows this practice decreases amygdala activation while increasing prefrontal activity, creating what neuroscientists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift interpretive frameworks rather than remaining locked in emotional reactivity. The third implementation component involves what psychologists call temporal distancing, analyzing current situations through historical or future perspective. Practical application includes what leadership consultant Jim Collins calls the historical comparison protocol, identifying relevant historical parallels to current challenges. This technique activates what neuroscientists call abstract processing networks, which counteract the concrete emotional processing that typically dominates during stress. Corporate implementation includes what Intel calls the future retrospective, analyzing current decisions from a future vantage point. Former CEO Andy Grove would regularly ask executives to imagine looking back on decisions 3 years later, creating what psychologists call psychological distance that counteracts emotional immediacy. Internal performance data showed this technique improved strategic decision quality by approximately 34% during high-pressure situations. The fourth implementation step involves what cognitive scientists call structured analytical practice, using formal frameworks to maintain cognitive function during emotional arousal. Practical application includes what military strategists call the decision journal, systematically recording analysis through consistent frameworks regardless of emotional state. This creates what psychologists call cognitive scaffolding, structured thought patterns that maintain function when emotions would otherwise disrupt analytical thinking. Financial sector implementation includes what hedge fund manager Ray Dalio calls the principles approach, analyzing situations through established decision criteria rather than emotional responses. Internal performance data at Bridgewater Associates shows this structured approach improved investment returns by approximately 28% during market volatility periods compared to more reactive decision models. The fifth implementation component involves what psychologists call controlled exposure practice, deliberately engaging with emotionally triggering material while maintaining cognitive function. Practical application includes what executive coach Marshall Goldsmith calls the trigger protocol, identifying personal emotional triggers and practicing analytical responses under controlled conditions. This creates what neuroscientists call emotional habituation, decreased reactivity through repeated exposure. Corporate implementation includes what Goldman Sachs calls stress simulation training, exposing traders to market crash scenarios while teaching specific cognitive techniques to maintain analytical function. Performance data shows this approach improves decision quality during actual market volatility by approximately 23% compared to untrained control groups. The gender-specific implementation involves what leadership researcher Dr. Herminia Ibarra calls contextual regulation, adapting emotional discipline techniques to navigate different expectations for men and women. For women in leadership positions, this often means what Ibarra terms strategic warmth integration, combining Machiavellian analytical detachment with calibrated emotional expression to navigate complex perception dynamics. Ethical implementation involves what moral philosophers call values alignment, ensuring that emotional discipline serves principled purposes rather than manipulative ends. Unlike Machiavelli's reputation for amorality, his actual writing emphasizes serving the greater good through strategic clarity, maintaining cognitive function specifically to advance meaningful values rather than merely personal advantage. Ultimately, implementing Machiavellian mental discipline transforms your relationship with emotional chaos, not by eliminating emotions, but by preventing them from eliminating your strategic capacity. As Machiavelli himself demonstrated through his remarkable response to personal catastrophe, the ability to maintain cognitive function during emotional turbulence represents perhaps the most valuable skill any strategic thinker can develop.